Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on low energy availability, training, adaptation, and performance. I'm Jose Areta. I'm going to be today's host. First of all, I want to thank you all for being present for this webinar. Originally, we thought of making this with really, humble intentions. And we are really blown away by the interest that this has gathered from you. And so we're really grateful for you to be present and here for us to share our research. So first of all, I want to outline the aims of today. So why we decided to do this. So reflecting on what was the actual purpose of doing this webinar. First of all, the idea is to share our latest research in this topic with the wider practitioner and researcher community. This is to promote and facilitate an open discussion on a current and relevant topic that we think it's in need of scientific evidence. And finally, of course, we want to stimulate further research to improve training and nutrient practices. Before we move on to the actual outline of the presentation, just going to do a bit of housekeeping and explain how the webinar will be run. Your microphones will be off throughout, but please feel free to write any questions you may have on the chat. At one point, I will chair the session. Another point, Karsten will chair the session. So just write down there whatever questions you might have, and we'll pick up on them and bring them up to discuss them. Feel free to have your camera on and off. That doesn't really make a difference. The format is that there will be 3 15-minute presentations plus questions. Please keep in mind that this is not going to be extremely strict, but we're going to try to follow that format, that duration. There's going to be a final roundtable to address any questions that we couldn't address during our presentations. And the seminar, as you probably heard the voice when you logged in, is being recorded. But please do not take any screenshots or any other captures of unpublished data. So the webinar timeline, first 10 minutes of introduction, which is what we are going through now. Then we're going to have Karsten presenting, myself presenting, Carl presenting, and then we're going to do a Q&A's roundtable where we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to present each of the speakers for tonight or today, depending where you are in the world. The first speaker representing the Technical University of Munich is Professor Karsten Köhler. Karsten is a professor in exercise, nutrition, and health at the Technical University of Munich. His research focuses on the topic, on the impact of exercise and calorie restriction on body composition and human metabolism. Karsten has conducted field and laboratory studies on LEA. Prominently, you might know his name because he's the only person that had research on males looking at the independent effect of exercise or low energy availability. Karsten's presentation is going to be titled as follows: Can increased dietary protein rescue the endocrine response in the low energy availability state? Following Karsten is myself, representing Liverpool John Moores University. I'm currently a lecturer in sports nutrition and metabolism at LJMU. I do research and practice mainly with endurance athletes, runners, triathletes, cyclists, and so on. My research has been in different areas related to training nutrient interactions, and I've been focusing lately, or I'm focused right now, on the effects of low energy availability on training adaptation and performance. The title of my talk is going to be How does low energy availability affect exercise capacity and training adaptation in endurance athletes? Following my talk, and again representing LJMU and Science in Sport, is going to be Dr. Langan-Evans. Carl is the former head of sports science support services on strength and conditioning at Liverpool John Moore University. Carl has extensive experience with combat sport athletes, such as Olympic sports, MMA, UFC, boxing, and Taekwondo. Carl is currently a postdoc funded by SIS, working a formulation of ergogenic nutritional aids for sports performance. Carl's talk title is going to be the effect of low energy availability on psychophysiological parameters and physical performance in sports athletes. Having introduced each of the speakers, I'm going to now hand in the presentation to Professor Koehler. Karsten, it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much. I hope that everybody can see my screen and my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we see you and hear you.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jose, for the very kind introduction. Like you already introduced the title of my talk today. I'm going to focus on kind of a new avenue we've been taking in the last few years, looking a little bit on different nutrients, especially specifically looking at dietary protein and whether that has potentially an impact on some of the responses in the low energy availability state. And just to give you a brief overview of my presentation, I'll start off with some of the basic endocrine and physiological consequences of LEA, but I will really focus down on skeletal muscle and bone, and then we'll see what endocrine axis we will focus on. And more importantly, I will then introduce potential counter strategies that we feel that may be beneficial in certain states of low EA to pursue to basically prevent some of the negative effects. I will then share some data and also hopefully some experiences from our recent short-term low energy availability studies. We have two studies that I'll specifically present, one focusing on high protein content during a period of low EA in conjunction with aerobic exercise, and then I'll also present data from a study that we recently completed, looking at resistance exercise done under LEA, and specifically the ability of protein supplementation after this resistance exercise. And then obviously I'll conclude with a brief conclusion and an outlook. So I think, or I hope that most of you are familiar with the definition of energy availability. Just to briefly wrap it up, it basically describes the amount of dietary energy that's available to sustain all other physiological functions after we've deducted the energy costs of exercise. So in the literature, and especially Professor Anne Laux has been really a person who's pushed this concept of energy availability. And she's also established kind of a normal range of this EA value, but to just give you a graphic representation, normal energy availability is typically considered in areas of around 40 to 45 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass. And again, since we're looking at the difference between the dietary intake and the exercise expenditure, the yellow bar is basically what remains as energy availability. Now, low states of energy availability can be achieved through multiple pathways. Just to remind you of that, we can either achieve that through increased exercise expenditure at the same level of energy intake, or at the same level of expenditure through a reduction in energy intake. Both of that resulting in the same low EA level, and we can maybe later speculate whether there are some potential differences, whether it's achieved one way or the other. But realistically, we see a combination of those two. But what's really important of the concept of energy availability, that it is really at the basis of two very prominent syndromes that have been described in the literature and have really received a lot of attention, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, one of them being the female and male athlete triad, and the other concept, the related relative energy deficiency of sport. We're not going to get into these different concepts, but I think that obviously the low energy availability being really at the basis of both of these concepts drives down the importance of this issue. The endocrine effects of low energy availability, I think, have been described very well in in the recent past, we have multiple endocrine axes that are affected by a low energy availability state, starting with the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. We're talking here about luteinizing hormone, very prominently estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Also hormones involved in the regulation of energy balance, appetite, food intake, such as leptin, ghrelin, PYY, insulin, etc., are affected by LEA, as are some hormones, specifically cortisol of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as thyroid hormones. T3 and T4 are typically reduced in the low EA state. But we're really going to focus on this last axis here, the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. And basically, to give you a brief review in basic physiology, what happens is that basically our hypothalamus releases somatostatin to stimulate the pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone has multiple actions, but one of the main actions of growth hormone, specifically in this axis, is to stimulate the liver to produce IGF-1, which can then function on various target tissues such as bone, skeletal muscle, as well as other tissues as well. And what's been shown in the past, and this we're coming back to Anne Laux, who kind of really coined this term of energy availability, and she also established some dose response curves for the endocrine responses. And you can see in this figure here, very prominent that with reducing energy availability, we see a reduction in IGF-1 with a concomitant increase in growth hormone. So if we graphically look at this, basically what we're seeing here is somewhat of a resistance of the liver to respond to growth hormone, meaning that less IGF-1 is produced in the LEA state, less IGF-1 is acting on those target tissues. And because there's a set negative feedback back to the hypothalamus, actually hypothalamus and pituitary are basically stimulating each other to produce more growth hormone to overcompensate. This is a classic negative feedback mechanism. But even in this increased state of growth hormone secretion, the liver does not respond adequately. So this really shows that, that there is a resistance at the liver. And it's not just related to IGF-1. Obviously, when we're looking at tissues, for example, bone, we can also see that certain markers of bone formation, such as osteocalcin, but also P1 and P, correlate quite well with IGF-1, so that we know that in this state of reduced IGF-1 production, bone formation is impaired as well. And we know of the effects of IGF-1 on skeletal muscle as well, so we can assume very similar effect there. And maybe Jose will talk some more about this more cellular levels in the muscle later. So, of course, this has been established quite a bit, and we'll get maybe a little bit more into some of the implications of this, but this also has led us to really think about, are there possible counter strategies to maybe balance out some of these negative effects of low energy availability on certain tissues, specifically bone and the muscle. And going into literature, it's actually this concept of growth hormone resistance at the liver is not limited to low energy availability, as we know it from exercising individuals. It has been actually really well described in a human model of starvation, such as anorexia nervosa. However, it's not limited to starvation or energy deficiency only. There are also other situations. For example, protein deficiency can lead to this growth hormone resistance, or other nutrients as well. So looking kind of beyond the scope, we have an idea that this may actually be impacted by other factors as well. What we also know quite well from the weight loss literature is that that when we look at the basically the downstream effect of this low energy availability or energy deficiency, we see weight loss as a result, of course, but we can actually manipulate the proportion of weight loss looking at adipose tissue versus lean mass. And again, one of the goals would be to preserve as much lean mass as possible. So we can do that actually by exercising, but we can really get actually a boost. And there are studies that have shown that even you can increase lean mass in a state of weight loss or energy deficiency by combining exercise with a high protein diet. So there's kind of some evidence gathering that high protein may be beneficial.
There we go.
Sorry. There's further evidence. There's data showing that protein actually may reverse, or the administration of protein may reverse this IGF-1 suppression directly at the liver. And also what has been reported in the literature across the lifespan, both in children as well as in older adults, that there is actually a positive association between dietary protein, exercise, and bone health as well. So all of this has really kind of set us up for a question whether we can use higher protein intakes as combination with exercise to really potentially rescue this growth hormone IGF-1 response, and more importantly, also protect lean mass and bone in a state of low energy availability. And this brings me to the first of the two studies that I want to discuss. In this study, as I mentioned before, we combined low energy availability with aerobic exercise. So we include the exercise component, but we have a non-weight bearing exercise here with a high protein diet to really ask this question. So our objective in this study was to determine whether an increased protein intake during this LEA state preserves lean mass and actually also reduces the uncoupling of bone turnover via the IGF-1 and growth hormone axis. This study was conducted as a repeated measures crossover design. We have 3 intervention or conditions, which I'll get to in a second. We really, as a proof of concept study, we really wanted to induce a large effect. So we restricted energy availability of 15 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass, so quite severe. And we conducted supervised aerobic exercise, so individuals exercised until they had actually expended 15 calories per kilogram fat-free mass per day again. The study was conducted in trained men who were young and rather on the lean side. We did that for several reasons. One of the primary reasons is that we know that, for example, leaner individuals tend to lose more lean mass compared to more or individuals with a higher body fat percentage. And we conduct this study specifically in young adults because we wanted to make sure that they recover quite quickly. And actually, since this was a repeated measure study, that they recover until the next bout and or the next condition and not suffer any consequences long term. The study, or here we see the 3 conditions that we conduct. We had 1 control condition. So in this control condition, we actually had energy availability at a level of 40 kilocalories per kilogram fat per mass. So basically that's the difference between our intake of 55 and the expenditure, as mentioned before, of 15. And we had a higher protein intake in this control condition, which I won't get into now. But more importantly, we had 2 conditions of low energy availability, both being at 15 kilocalories per kilogram fat per mass, both exercising, so intake was the same. The only difference between the conditions was that we once had a normal protein intake in the range of the RDA, and once we had protein intake of 1.7 grams per kilogram, which is the upper kind of level of the recommendation of the ACSM. And the study was done over 5 days, and during which individuals received their controlled diet. We actually used this liquid diet along with supplementation because we look at some bone markers. We wanted to make sure that calcium as well as vitamin D intakes were controlled. We used the liquid diet here specifically for 2 reasons. First of all, because we wanted to blind participants, so they actually did not know what condition they were in, and also because we wanted to really tailor the diet very specifically to make sure that really the only differences are in the protein intake and there are no other differences. As I said, participants exercised aerobically on a bike ergometer at 60% VO2 max. We collected blood, measured body composition, and conducted several tests of aerobic fitness in this intervention. As a result, these are changes in body composition, and looking at this, we can definitely say our goal was achieved. With a high protein diet, we drastically shifted weight loss. And again, look at the numbers here. We're losing about 2 kilograms over 5 days. So it's quite a severe energy deficit, but nevertheless, we're shifting weight loss away from lean tissues, shown here, towards fat loss, which is one of the primary goals, and this is very consistent with other weight loss literature too. So this is exactly what we we expended. However, when we're looking at IGF-1 signaling as well as bone turnover, results were not as exciting. For example, looking at IGF-1, we barely saw any, or we did not really see any differences between the two LEA conditions, so protein did not have an effect. We also looked at markers of turnover, and really the most interesting effect that we saw, that with a low protein diet, actually there was an increase, significant increase in sclerostin, which is an anti-anabolic marker of bone turnover, which was not present with a high protein diet. So there are possibly some benefits, but not as strong as we expected. So in order to summarize this first study, we were able to show that an increased protein intake of 1.7 grams per kilogram during 5 days of LEA attenuated the loss of lean mass, promoted fat loss, and actually also increased fat oxidation. This is data that I did not show today. It prevented increases in sclerostin, but not in IGF, or did not change IGF-1, and also did not impact other bone markers significantly. What another kind of take-home message for us, that this non-weight bearing exercise actually alone, without the increased protein, is insufficient to preserve lean mass and bone in the LEA state. And that brings me actually to my second study that I would like to present today, which focused actually on resistance exercise. And I think this is one of the first studies, at least that I'm aware of, that specifically looked at response to resistance exercise in the state of LEA. And we obviously wanted to top this also with the common practice of protein feeding post-exercise. So our primary objectives were to quantify the impact of LEA on the growth hormone IGF-1 axis, and specifically on the response to an acute bout of resistance exercise, and then also some downstream effects, again, looking at bone, and also to test whether protein feeding post-exercise actually has a beneficial effect on this response. So again, very similarly, this was another repeated measure crossover design. Again, 3 conditions. Again, we induced the same level of LEA. This time there was no aerobic exercise component, but a resistance exercise, which we conducted only once. So there's only a single exercise bout, and then the difference was the post-exercise feeding. Again, we did this study this time in men and women, but they were resistance trained, had resistance training experience, again, young and on the lean side for the similar reasons as mentioned before. Here again are our 3 conditions. Again, our control condition at 40 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass. Actually, this is a typo up here, I'm sorry. Protein intake in all 3 conditions was actually the same. So the only difference was what we fed participants after the resistance exercise bout, once we gave them protein in the LEA state, and once we gave them the same amount of carbohydrates. In the control condition, we only fed carbohydrate. This study was shorter because we did not do any exercise. We only did this study over 3 days. Again, liquid diet along with supplementation. I said no exercise minus the resistance exercise bout, which happened on day 2. Then again, no exercise, collected blood and body composition again. But more specifically, we actually followed much more closely up what happened acutely in response to this resistance exercise bout. So here you see we basically inserted a catheter and did frequent blood sampling once before the exercise, right after the exercise. Then participants received their carbohydrate or protein. After an hour, we drew another blood sample. After 2 hours, next blood sample. Only then were participants allowed to consume their first meal. Again, 4 to 6 hours, next meal, 10 hours, next meal. And 24 hours later, we drew the last blood sample to really catch this post-exercise response. Looking at body composition, again, very similarly, we actually achieved similar amounts of weight loss only in 3 days. But this time, obviously, because there was, other than the supplementation, no difference, we really did not expect and did not see any difference in body composition between the 2 conditions, like I said, which was expected. The really key finding of this study, and I think this has a lot of significance because it really shows how our body responds in this LEA state, is shown down here. We see that compared to the control, condition. So this is in a normal state of energy availability. We actually see about 2.5-fold increase in growth hormone in response to this acute exercise bout, right? Post-exercise. And looking at the area under the curve as well as the peak, there's virtually no difference whether we feed individuals carbohydrate or protein right after the exercise bout in terms of this response. So this shows very nicely part one, the growth hormone increase in growth hormone, and part two, it also shows the inability of our body to respond to this growth hormone spike with an adequate IGF-1 response. We also see that the IGF-1 response is significantly blunted. Looking here again at the area under the curve, and as at the change over the time, that there are no differences between whether we feed carbohydrate or protein. The response remains blunted. We did again also look at some bone turnover, specifically sclerostin here, and and what we actually see that sclerostin increases again with LEA, which is not surprising, but also with inactivity, which is actually because even in a control condition it increases. And then the exercise at least prevents the sclerostin to increase further, which is at least somewhat important. So summarizing the second study, we actually were able to show that even 2 to 3 days of LEA at 15 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass disrupt the responsiveness of the growth hormone IGF-1 axis, specifically to this acute bout of resistance exercise. And this disruption is basically independent of whether we feed carbohydrates or protein after exercise. So post-exercise, at least in terms of 30 grams, does not have an effect on the responsiveness here. Obviously, these were just 2 studies, but there are many other questions arise from these studies. For example, or the question, what can we do more to further close the gap in terms of preserving muscle mass and bone, if we're looking at this narrow window, for example, feeding greater amounts of protein even either distributed over the day, as well as post-exercise would be one question. The other question, obviously, is we've only compared rather severe level of LEA to control. We have not been able to establish a dose response curve yet. So the question, of course, arrives is whether this threshold of about 30 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass also applies to this responsiveness, for example, to resistance exercise. And then, of course, more work, and this may be more on the practical side, needs to be done to quantify the long-term effects of LEA on lean mass, on bone strength, but also on performance. But again, keeping in mind the intersection between exercise and protein in the state of LEA. So with that, I would like to acknowledge several of our funders who were involved in this research, but also supported some of my other research. I would specifically like to thank my lab groups at the Technical University of Munich, but more importantly, even at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I was until about a year and a half ago, where all of the practical work for this was conducted. And I really would like to highlight the work done by Chase Murphy. He's been the author of both of the studies, and he's actually done about probably 95% of the work on these studies, so he should really get all the credit. Chase is currently finishing up with his PhD, and I'm sure he'll hate me for saying that, but if you're looking for a talented and skilled postdoc or an assistant professor, he's going on the job market soon, so please feel free to contact me, and I'll happily forward his information. Well, and with that, of course, I would like to thank Jose for organizing this event, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karsten. That was great. We're running a little bit over time, so we're gonna bring up the questions at the end in the Q&As. Just a quick question from someone about the first study. Do you have any idea when that will be published? Is that in the pipeline?
It is. It is. It's yes. It has been. It has been submitted and has been rejected once before. But we'll submit it basically. Yeah, within. We hope to get it published until the end of the year, or maybe by March for sure.
Great. We're looking forward to see that out there and read it in full. Then we're going to bring up some questions that people have asked about that. But now we're going to move into the next presentation, which is mine. So I'm going to just share my screen. Can you confirm that you can see my screen that I'm sharing? Yes, I got a thumbs up there. Yes. Perfect. Good. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again for being present. It's great to have this audience to share our research. The title of my talk is How Does Low Energy Availability Affect Exercise Capacity and Training Adaptation in Endurance Athletes? So I'm going to start this presentation by saying that as portrayed in the triad model and the red S models, it is clear that chronic low energy availability can be harmful to health and therefore performance. And this is very much the view that I had early on during my PhD studies when I started working in this topic. But also early on, I realized that it was possible to have a very black and white view on things, where energy balance or achieving energy balance always is a good thing, and dropping into low energy availability is a bad thing. But then I realized things at one point might be a little bit more complex than this. And to portray a little bit what made me reflect about this, I'm going to tell you a story. And the story starts with a cat and a storm on an evening in February of 2015. This is the cat, Christina. Christina was 7.8 kilos back then. You may know that the average weight of a cat is around 4.5 kilos. And it seems that the cat got possibly scared or confused in this stormy night in Melbourne. And it seems that it had an accident. We found the cat in the back of our backyard with a lower back injury, as X-rays at the veterinary were showing. And she had soft and hard tissue damage. So severely impaired hind limb mobility, and she could barely move. And the excess body weight further improved the mobility. Based on what the veterinary was saying, so the prognosis is like she was likely going to be euthanized. And this was my girlfriend's cat. And I was, of course, did what any good boyfriend would do, which is try to save the life of the cat and put the cat in a recovery program. So the first important step of the recovery program was to get the cat to lose weight. And so I did control the pellets intake of the cat, and I had a very sensitive set of scales, an industrial set of scales back then. And over the course of almost 2 months, made the cat lose a significant amount of weight. So the cat dropped about 30% of body weight, which is it's not a small amount. But what I found remarkable in this process was that the mobility and agility of the cat increased dramatically, as well as the locomotion. The cat went from barely being able to walk to have like just being walking around the house and going, jumping on surfaces and so on, very, very quick. She's now healthy and happy cat. But of course, an overweight cat is not the same as a high performance athlete. Anecdotal evidence is not rigorous, and correlation is not causation. We cannot say that low energy availability is what allowed the cat to recover. But I think inductive reasoning is important, and this set me to reflect on what I had observed and made me look into maybe more rigorous literature. So what I found looking at the literature was that some top athletes seem to be exposed to low energy availability and lose weight during intensified training and prior to competitions, and still compete at the highest level. And importantly, we can see that in some studies, athletes lose some weight, but they still can improve their physical capacity. In the next presentation, Carl is going to present some information related to this, but I want to share some further insights that I had this time working with a Homo sapiens, so an athlete. And a study that we published early this year, a case study. So I've been working with an elite female athlete for a few years. And we have data of body weight, menstrual function, and physical capacity of this athlete for 5 years. So something that caught my eye of working with this athlete, it was that during the period of impaired menstrual function, is when this athlete was able to achieve the highest relative power output for a range of durations. This made me think, oh, okay, it seems that if we relate this menstrual or impaired menstrual function to low energy availability, and this athlete is in low or has been in low energy availability, then skeletal muscle might still be able to achieve high oxidative capacity in the face of this. But the absolute power output was achieved in a period of eumenorrhea. But this got me thinking, and I was thinking, like, how is actually skeletal muscle affected by low energy availability? And this brings up further reflection. Low energy availability imposes low carbohydrate availability. So what is the role of low energy availability in early responses to training? So if we think that in energy balance, there's an adequate availability or high availability of carbohydrates, and in low energy availability, there's low availability of carbohydrates, then you would expect that also you have different amounts of glycogen in these two different states. And we know from a series of studies that the amount of skeletal muscle glycogen is very important in modulating the intracellular responses to training adaptation. So we know that when training with low muscle glycogen, supposedly we see adaptations that might reflect or might result in enhanced oxidative capacity. So I was thinking, is it the low energy availability or is it the low glycogen? The majority of the studies that do this training with low muscle glycogen, concomitantly induce an acute state of low energy availability. How can we test this? So what we can do is, in the low glycogen state, put back the energy in the form of fat. And this is what we did in this study that I'm gonna share now, that got published 2 months ago. This is the experimental design of the study. What did we do in this study? We recruited 9 well-trained males, and we did follow this sleep low protocol in a crossover design. So in this protocol, we had our participants doing a glycogen depleting session where they did about 2,000 calories of energy expenditure. So there was an amount of energy expenditure that the athletes could comfortably or not so comfortably do, but during 2 hours, but we were sure that they were gonna able to do this. And because this was a crossover design, then they went through 2 different interventions in different occasions. In one intervention, they pretty much put back all the energy that they expended on the bike with a low carbohydrate, high fat diet that we say has adequate energy availability or energy balance, high fat intervention. Or in the other group, they had a low carbohydrate, low fat, low energy availability, that we call it an energy deficit, low fat intervention. So in these 2, we have our participants staying overnight in our premises, and then they exercised again in the morning, where we took muscle samples and blood samples. respiratory gases, and subjective parameters of how they were feeling. I want to explain this in a second. So I must highlight that both interventions were low carbohydrate and isonitrogenous interventions. So they had the same amount of carbs and the same amount of protein, but they were different in the amount of fat that they had. So we could achieve the same amount, or sorry, different amounts of energy availability just by manipulating the fat. The primary outcome measures, so the important or the main parameters that we were interested in, that we measured, were skeletal muscle glycogen, gene expression, and intracellular signaling. And the secondary outcome measures were resting metabolic rate, substrate use, blood metabolites, subjective hunger, and sleep quality. So let's look at the results of the primary outcome measures. We're going to first see the glycogen. So as we would expect, glycogen dropped after the morning exercise, and it was not different between the two groups. I forgot to mention that after the exercise, they had a recovery drink with carbohydrates and protein. I'm sorry about that. Then looking at the intracellular signaling, just briefly showing the results here because I wouldn't have time to show all the signaling proteins or intracellular signaling proteins. There were no treatment effects on AMPK or mTOR pathway. Someone did like a little bit of a scribble on my screen, it seems. Let's look at what happened with the gene expression. So there was predominantly no treatment effect. We look at genes of a variety of pathways, but mainly related to carbohydrate and protein and fat metabolism, as well as markers of mitochondrial biogenesis. Two key markers of mitochondrial biogenesis, PGC1 alpha and P53, showed a time effect, and there was an interaction in P53. And there was a difference at 3 hours being higher in the energy deficit low fat group. Let's look at the secondary outcome measures. Let's look at resting metabolic rate and what happened there. So there were no changes in resting metabolic rate in this treatment. There was a decrease respiratory exchange ratio in both groups. So both groups were using more fat because they had a lower carbohydrate availability, but there were no difference between groups. We look at the respiratory gases during exercise. They were exercising at about 60% of VO2 max at different stages during the exercise in the morning. No differences in VO2 and no difference in substrate use, but you see the fat oxidation is quite high. So these participants are using about twice as much fat as you would expect someone would maximally use in a normal fed state. And because VO2 and substrate use were not different, also the efficiency was not different as you would expect. And let's look at the blood metabolites that this really caught my eye. So we look at plasma glucose and plasma insulin. We see that in the energy balance high fat group, there is an impaired response of regulation of glycemia. And so the area under the curve in the energy balance high fat group is increased. When we look at rate of perceived exertion during exercise, then subjective hunger and sleep quality, we see there was no difference in any of these between the two treatments. So how do I interpret these results? So my take on it is that achieving energy balance with a high fat meal did not enhance early markers of skeletal muscle adaptation to training. There was an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis markers in both groups, but there was, it seems, a further increase in the P53 mRNA content in the energy deficit low fat group, which maybe suggests a positive effect of low energy availability in achieving an oxidative phenotype, or it could also be a negative effect of the high fat. Then on the energy balance high fat group, there was an impaired glucose regulation after the recovery drink. So when it comes to a practical recommendation that we could take from this particular study is that when following a training low model, and you want an athlete to train with low muscle glycogen, it seems that achieving energy balance with high fat is likely not beneficial, at least acutely. And we must take into consideration that the markers that we took are early markers of response to the interventions that we did. And we either need to do more advanced analysis or do this repeatedly to be able to draw stronger conclusions. But these are early good indicators. Further reflections on these findings and looking at other findings in the literature that I discussed before, it seems that the short and long-term effects of low energy availability on muscular adaptive responses and aerobic wear capacity are unclear when it comes to oxidative capacity. And there's definitely more research that is needed. When it comes to endurance athletes, there might be a potential performance enhancing effect of short low energy availability through improving power to rate ratio if approached carefully. This is, of course, a double-edged sword, and we don't want to fall into the negative effects of prolonged energy availability. But as it stands, it might be that the negative effects of low energy availability on endurance performance might be indirect or potentially direct, but it's not yet clear how it affects skeletal muscle. I think it's very important that we distinguish between acute and chronic LEA. It might generate different responses. And all of this makes me reflect, can low energy availability be considered a stressor? Can it be that the right dose of it is good and too much and no recovery can lead to injury? So having this in mind, I just took the freedom of thinking of a theoretical response to low energy availability, and this might be a bit too much for a short seminar and just some evidence, but it's nice to think beyond what we see a little bit. And we know that the low energy availability disrupts homeostasis, and maybe the short effect of low energy availability could lead to some sort of adaptive response. Whereas if this is prolonged through time, the early the early disruptions that we see in endocrine and metabolic parameters become visible through physiological responses and functional outcomes that when prolonged through months, they can increase the likelihood of injury and of course result in maladaptive responses. This is just an idea. Maybe it's a bit too theoretical, but I just thought it was pertinent to share it, maybe to have a bit more nuanced appreciation of what low energy availability can do rather than a black and white sort of response. But of course, we need rigorous science to be able to test this. I think that's all for me. I think we are a little bit behind schedule. But we are, I don't know, Karsten, if you want to bring up any question.
Well, thank you very much, Jose. I think I hope we have time for one question. I've just been kind of screening what's going on in the chat. And I think maybe you can elaborate very quickly, and I think we'll return to this later, but elaborate quickly if you would expect any differences in if this study was done in female athletes, given that there are obviously differences in fat metabolism or substrate metabolism specifically.
Are you referring to the, for example, the amount of fat that they were using in the morning? If you're referring to that, I don't think the differences would be really massive, provided they are at least partially glycogen depleted. I think the availability of carbohydrates, exogenous carbohydrates and endogenous carbohydrates are important regulators of fat metabolism. They are such strong regulators. I think this would potentially overcome any gender differences, but it's just speculation. I don't have any solid reference that I can think of now to support my what I'm saying right now. In terms of whether they are more sensitive to these changes in low energy availability, and we can observe any more acute or more marked responses in skeletal muscle. Honestly, I don't know. I think we need to potentially look at that population. I think this it's very important to consider that it was only about 12 hours of exposure to low energy availability, which is, based on the literature, doesn't seem to be long enough to generate a very clear or strong endocrine response. Like, we know if this is repeated through time, then you begin to see the more clear decrease in specific hormones. But with such short period of time, I think it would be a bit harder to detect that. Cool. All right. I think we can pass the baton to Carl.
Thanks, Jose. Just checking, guys. Can everyone see the screen okay? Brilliant. Fantastic. So yeah, thanks for the invite from Jose to be involved in this webinar. I'll try and make mine a little bit more brief, guys, in regards to making up for time, so we've got time for questions. What I would say is that those are really two tough acts to follow, but hopefully I'm going to try and give a little bit more of an applied angle in regards to some of the information that's been presented, and try and give some context to that as well from the point of view of working with combat sports. So just to give a little bit of an overview in terms of combat sport culture, for those who might not be aware, there's a lot of different combat sports that have a range of different weight categories. Yellow denotes the weight categories that are in the Olympic Games. There are some with lots of weight categories, smaller gaps. There are some with less weight categories and larger gaps. Independent of those different types of weight classes, there's a big culture in combat sports of making weight. And typically these guys will do this through some extreme methods, such as very extreme dehydration, use of things like laxatives, and also techniques such as spitting and even vomiting. For those who might be more interested in and around the realm, I was very fortunate to be involved in a paper a few years ago which tried to characterize the effect of this from a psychophysiological point of view within an MMA athlete. So I would encourage you to go and check out this paper, and that'll give a little bit more context. And then from that point of view, this is just some data from my PhD, where this tends to be a reciprocal cycle within this sport, where due to the different weight categories and then stakeholder advisement, particularly from people like coaches and parents, athletes tend to engage in these practices, and then there's limited stakeholder education from national and world governing bodies, and we just get this reciprocal cycle. So a typical, I suppose, even gold standard or I suppose effective weight strategy for combat sport athletes to make weight would involve generally where the athletes both increase exercise energy expenditure and decrease energy intake. On top of that, they'll also try and manipulate muscle glycogen content in order to reduce bound water. They'll do the same by going on low residue, low sodium, low fiber diets to try and reduce gut fiber content in interstitial fluids. You'll see a reduction in the amount of endogenous fluid intaken or a complete cessation of that. And then they'll try to induce both active and passive methods of perspiration and sweating. So on that basis, on the guidelines of what we know in terms of the different thresholds of energy availability, predominantly combat sport athletes will be in a state of low energy availability throughout their entire camp. And this can range from periods as short as 4 weeks to as long as 12 weeks. We know that the low energy availability threshold of 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day has an effect on both models of the athlete triad and also the relative energy deficiency in sports model, which looks as so, and can lead to a range of health-related and also performance-related consequences. So what I want to present today, and I apologize to a lot of people who've probably heard me speak about this on numerous occasions, but one thing I can promise is that we've got a little bit of additional data in there, is a recent case study we did on a combat sport athlete, which was published in Medicine and Science in Sport and Exercise. And what we were trying to characterize was the health and performance impact of a period of low energy availability on potential symptoms of REDS in a male combat sport athlete who was undergoing a large body mass loss. So the athlete in question was a Taekwondo athlete. These are their baseline characteristics. So habitually they would compete in the -68 or 150-pound featherweight category. Their baseline fat mass, lean body mass or fat-free mass was as so. And from that basis, it was established that they could lose a required amount of mass to get to a lower weight category in order to make them more competitive and qualify for the European University Games. Habitually, they were the type of athletes who had engaged in the methods that I talked about earlier on and had a lot of issues making the regular weight category. So they weren't naturally enthused when we suggested that they could potentially make a lower weight category, but they gave us the opportunity to try. So we conducted an 8-week camp, and across the period at baseline, we took measures of body composition using dual X-ray absorptiometry. We also did an assessment of some of skin folds. We assessed cardiac function. We took a number of blood-based markers, rest and metabolic rate, and we also did some cardiorespiratory performance-based tests as well. We repeated the skin fold assessment weekly. And then at the halfway stage of the camp, we repeated these measures, and then the week prior to the competition event. We also conducted some performance-based markers. So we looked at force velocity profile and absolute and relative strength, and also a number of psychological markers, which again, we repeated our halfway stage and the week prior to the event. In the week leading into the event and the week post, we repeated the following markers. And then throughout all of those time points, we also repeated the same psychological assessments as well. So in regards to energy or energy availability, there are a lot of factors within the equation that we need to consider, particularly from an applied setting, in order to try and be as accurate as we can in the estimation. One paper I would certainly encourage everybody on the call to go and have a look at is a fantastic one by Louise Burke, which examines the pitfalls of conducting energy availability assessments in free living athletes and those conditions. So to try and mitigate any of the inaccuracies, one thing that we did initially is that we provided all of the energy intake for the athlete throughout the entire period. And that was on the basis of meeting the caloric requirements of rest and metabolic rate, which was around 1,700 kilocalories. And we broke that down into 2.3 grams per kilo fat-free mass of protein, 3.4 grams of carbohydrates, and close to nearly 1 gram of fat, resulting in an energetic intake of their rest and metabolic rate. Throughout the period, we didn't allow any ergogenic supplemental aids. That was mainly because we didn't want this to be a confounding factor on any of the effects, the health or performance effect of REDS. In terms of energy availability, as part of my PhD, I had done a validity and accuracy and reliability study on this piece of equipment called an ActiHeart, which is a combined heart rate and activity monitor. And it's quite a nice piece of kit in the sense that you can put it onto a polar style belt, and the software system will allow you to be quite defined in terms of the periods of time that you measure in as well. On top of that, we also measured every single session using activity and heart rate based monitoring to give us an estimation of internal training load. And we also did that subjectively for external training load. So across the entire period, in terms of training, the athlete conducted 3 fasted steady state runs throughout the week, 2 high intensity interval training sessions, 2 resistance based training sessions, and then their typical habitual Taekwondo training with a rest day. And from those numbers that we got from the activity and heart rate monitor, we were able to establish that throughout the entire period, the athlete was in a state of, or what is classified as low energy availability. So how that looked over the period was, for the first 7 weeks, they were on a clamped energy intake of 1,700 kilocalories. In the week leading in, due to low residue diet and the strategy to try and reduce muscle glycogen, that was sequentially reduced. We can see in the period that we followed the athletes afterwards, or the week afterwards, that was the energy intake, and this was ad libitum energy intake, was dramatically increased. And when we mapped that against estimations of exercise energy expenditure, we're then able to make some calculations of energy availability. And this is what they look like throughout the entire intervention period. So for the first 7 weeks, we were looking at an average of around 20 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass, whereas in the final week leading into the competition, that was below 10 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass, and then it was above an acceptable threshold in the recovery period. Final thing that we assessed was something called within-day energy balance. So obviously, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the energy balance equation. Where this is different is that it gives us a more longitudinal view, independent of the 24-hour view of energy balance, I suppose, estimation. And what we're looking for here across the 24 hours is times in deficit and times in surplus in terms of the magnitude across a daily, weekly, or whatever period it is that you're measuring. And from that, we can try and then make estimations of both states of anabolism, catabolism, and balance. Full credit to Monica Torstvedt for making me aware of this from this fantastic paper. So we took their methodology and plugged it into an Excel calculator, and this is how we made our calculations of this method. So getting into the results now. So in terms of total body mass, these were the results. So we got the athlete to reduce their body mass from 72.5 kilos to make the -63 category at 62.7 kilos, representing a total loss of over 13% body mass. The way I want us to think about this, and this is how we've characterized it within the paper, is looking at it in phases. So phase 1 would be the first 7 weeks. Phase 2 would be the week leading into the event, and then phase 3 would be the recovery. And that's how I'll try and characterize some of the results moving forwards. There are going to be some red bubbles highlighting some key data in this, and this is one of the things that I want people to keep in mind towards the end of the presentation, which is the large increase in body mass in quite a short period of time. This is how the athlete looked at the end of the intervention period, and these are some of the body composition assessment measures that we got from sum of skin folds and DEXA fat mass percentage, in line with fat-free mass or lean body mass and DEXA fat mass as well. Again, key to highlight that there was a dramatic reduction in the free fat mass estimation from DEXA in the phase 2, the final week leading into the competition. But again, from great work from Louise Burke's lab in terms of some of the fantastic studies they've done, this is more than likely obviously just an artifact of the reductions in glycogen and total body water as a product of trying to make the final weight. So in terms of relative energy deficiency in sports model, we tried to characterize this through a lot of the measures that we did. So first, if we examine the metabolic factors, so we measured resting metabolic rate, and we also used the Cunningham equation to establish a predictive value as well. From this, we then were able to establish an RMR ratio, which is indicative of potential energy deficiency. And we can see in phase 2, in the 5 days from -1 week into the pre-cut phase, that we have a dramatic reduction in that measured resting metabolic rate. In terms of adaptive thermogenesis, within the first 4 weeks, this drop is quite minimal. Generally a little bit larger in the 7 weeks leading into the event, and then in only 5 days in phase 2 tends to be quite dramatic. Again, you can see from the measured resting metabolic rate, there's a large overshoot there, and again, that'll make more sense a little bit later on towards the end of the presentation. In terms of the blood-based markers that we assessed, it's particularly looking at specific endocrine hormones. In terms of in terms of cortisol, we see that there's a general steady state in the cortisol measurements that we've assessed, and a transient reduction in the assessment of testosterone, which doesn't become clinically relevant until we get to the final stage, phase 2 stage, in those final 5 days where we go below energy intake, resting metabolic rate. And this is a similar trend for some of the other sex-related hormones that we assessed, in terms of having markers that are outside of normative ranges within that 5-day phase 2 period. Following on from this, we also wanted to look at cardiovascular function, because this is something that's purported to be affected within the REDS model. And in terms of left and right ventricular structure and function. We didn't see any effect of low energy availability status throughout the entire period. And we also assessed cardiac output and heart rate. And what we tend to see there is a classical adaptative response in terms of the athletes improve induced to the training regime. The increase from the pre-cut to the weigh-in is as a result of them losing weight through dehydration. And it's just important to highlight, even though the athletes only lost around about 2.5% of body mass through dehydration, the effects on the cardiac system can be quite pronounced. Furthermore, examining bone health. So this is quite relevant in terms of what Karsten was discussing before. We looked at this from 2 points of view. First, through measurements of whole, femoral neck, and also lumbar spine bone mineral density and bone mineral content. We didn't see any changes in those, but generally you wouldn't see that based on the short measurement period. But we just wanted to establish that the athlete was not only was there no change, but the athlete was efficient in terms of their bone mineral density. And then, as Karsten mentioned before, we took measures of P1NP and beta-CTX for bone formation and reabsorption. And in terms of CTX for reabsorption, all of the measures that we took throughout the entire period were markedly high, whereas measures of bone formation were also high. So despite the CTX measures being above the highest reference range in an athletic population, the formation markers were quite high as well. So at every point, the athlete was in a positive bone ratio in terms of turnover. Again, we can't speculate too much on why that might be, but we hypothesized within the paper it was more than likely an artifact of the osteogenic stimulus of the athlete's training activities, similar to what Karsten mentioned a little bit earlier on. Finally, in terms of health-related markers, we looked at psychological function, and these are some excerpts from some of the semi-structured interviews that we took from the athletes. We measure the profile of mood states, and as we can see throughout the majority of the entire intervention period, we see a classical iceberg profile in terms of vigor related to the other markers. The red line is indicative of the athlete's weigh-in day, which was reduced, unsurprisingly, given that they'd had to do a dehydration. But this returns to that classical profile in the post measures, and the total mood disturbance score doesn't reach any clinical relevance at any stage throughout the entire period. So in terms of performance-based markers, we didn't see any depression or irritability. That wasn't reported as part of any of the semi-structured interviews, and these were some of the other performance-based markers that we assessed. In terms of training load, subjective training load, and also daily well-being score, the athlete was able to complete all of the prescribed training load and didn't go below a relevant threshold of daily well-being score that we assessed. And finally, in terms of performance markers, in terms of both lower and upper absolute and relative strength, we saw increases. In terms of upper and lower force velocity profile and also power profiles, we saw increases. And then in terms of cardiorespiratory capacity, we also saw absolute and relative increases as well across the entire periods. So just trying to wrap things up now so we have enough time for available questions. Part of the within day energy balance assessment that we did the cumulative assessment as recommended within the Torstvedt paper. And by the end of the intervention period, what we saw was that the athlete was in a near 105,000 kilocalorie deficit in relation to energy intake. Despite the athlete intaking nearly 33,000 calories in the week following, that only starts to marginally plateau off that. What we can see is this was the type of foods that the athlete was ingesting in the post recovery period. So they were having quite a good time in terms of the amounts of foods that they were intaking, inclusive of alcohol. And what I'd like to show you now is some data that we've provided within the paper that I haven't showed before. We can see in the top left-hand corner baseline, top right-hand corner the end of the intervention, and the bottom graph energy expenditure at different relative speeds on a VO2 peak test, and also fat oxidation profile. So we see at baseline a typical profile for the athlete, which is increased substantially by the end of the intervention period. But in a series of only 7 days after that energetic intake of those different types of foods, we see a remarked reduction in the athlete's capacity to, or the athlete's fat oxidation capacity at exercise. Additionally to that, this is the insulin profile of the athletes all throughout the intervention period. This is 2 days post competition, and then this is in the 7 days, so dramatically increased. So we see hyperinsulinemia, which is represented by a near 440% increase from baseline. We also see marked increases in both LDL and also total cholesterol during the weigh-in phase, which is normative for athletes undergoing dehydration, but then also in the post-recovery period. And then finally, just to highlight some experts from the semi-structured interviews, the athletes made comment to the fact that they were continually eating all the time. Sometimes they didn't realize why. It felt like it was out of boredom and almost like an autopilot response to try and seek out as much food as they possibly could. So just to highlight for some people who may not be aware, this isn't something that is uncharacterized. So this is a phenomenon known as rebound hyperphagia and has been studied as long ago as the early 1900s. As a result of that, if we think back to some of the results we saw earlier in the presentation, what we do get is body mass and fat mass overshoot typically, as can be seen in these studies. And again, one thing about this is that there's a potential. This was a fantastic paper a few years ago that highlighted that potential weight cycling could cause subsequent weight gain in middle age. Again, this is not uncommon for combat sports athletes, and a very famous one from the UK, and Ricky Hatton, is certainly somebody who says he suffered from this condition. So just to highlight to everybody, so a little bit of future research. One thing that we do have, and I know somebody mentioned before the effects on females, is we're currently doing a case study on a female UFC athlete that we work with. We've done exactly the same design that I've presented to you guys today, but we've done this longitudinally over 18 months. So we're just in the final stages of data collection for that, and we're hoping to get that out in the new year to highlight some more of this kind of research in a case study design, but on a female athlete and across subsequent camps. So just finishing up, and hopefully we've got enough time for questions. I'd like to thank all my colleagues at Liverpool John Moores University. I'd like to thank my co-authors on this case study, so Mr. Mark Germain and Mario Artukovic, Dr. Dave Oxborough for doing the cardiac measures, of course, Dr. Jose Areta for his expertise in writing the manuscript, and absolutely my two mentors, Professors Graham Close and James Morton, who helped me with all this and got me to this stage. So any questions, I'd be happy to answer, and thank you very much for everyone's attention.
That's great. Thank you so much, Carl. That was an amazing presentation. I think we are good to just jump straight into the roundtable if you guys agree. So we just can unmute your microphone, Karsten and Carl, and we can bring up some of the questions that some of the people there have sent through the chat. So we have here two questions for Karsten. Karsten, do you want to read your interpretation of the question, or do you want me to?
Why don't you ask it and I'll answer?
Okay, yeah. So Mark Houston says, like, presumably when protein contribution is higher to overall calorie intake, then carbohydrate contribution is lower. If you then pair with the daily aerobic exercise, how much do you think the lower proportion of carbohydrate in the diet contributed to the greater levels of fat mass loss?
Well, first of all, I think it's you're definitely right. We're always playing around with three macronutrients, and I think Jose kind of went a slightly other route, but he looked at fat and carbohydrate. So it's always tricky to account for all of three, and this was actually one of the bigger challenges in our study. What we actually did is that we supplemented carbohydrates during the exercise bout in this study to make sure that they wouldn't run into a hypoglycemic state and maybe observe, a more drastic carbohydrate depletion through that exercise. But I think you're right in a way that you to some degree need a deficit in either fat or carbohydrate. However, we focused more than anything on reducing, or basically bringing up the protein intake by reducing the fat intake as much as that was possible with our liquid diet combinations. But there's kind of I think at least from a non-exercising but resting state, there's actually a nice paper from Kevin Hall from a few years back done in the metabolic warts, where basically they were able to show that it's really not as much the carbohydrate reduction, but more than anything, a reduction in fat intake that drives the increased loss in fat mass during weight loss. So I think I actually, yeah, I think it kind of hopping back onto what Jose has presented. I think if you cut back, I think it's better to cut back on fat than on protein if you want to see those benefits.
Cool. Yeah, what do you think? And this is adding to what you say in the study by Kevin Hall. Normally, I think Kevin's studies are amazing. They're like yeah, they're like huge, like really well controlled, and like a lot of participants and so on. They're kind of dream studies for what we want to do, but they really don't incorporate exercise. And I think this is a key difference between some of what this big research is doing and what we are doing. It seems like we always add the contractile stimulus there that can make a huge difference. What's your take on that?
Well, I think you're right that this is a unique situation, and you know, I mean the fat oxidation values that you showed, the fat oxidation that Carl showed, and I didn't have time to actually show this, but we also see actually a fairly dramatic increase in fat oxidation in this LEA state, which actually reminds me kind of some of the studies coming from Louise Burke's group that has shown, you know, the effects of low carbohydrate fat situations where we see very similar increases, but in an energy balance state. So actually, I think this is really something we really have to delineate much more. Is it a substrate deficit, or is it an overall energy deficit that seems to be tailored? And I think that's just, you know, in this very special situation where you basically exercise, and we did that intentionally, exercise at moderate intensities, which is your range of maximal fat oxidation. So it is. I think the biggest challenge is that really to delineate all these things. So what you would need to some degree is really probably a 9-way crossover study where you control for all these factors. Then you won't get any participants anymore. Yeah,
totally. Another couple of questions here. So 2 people are asking the same thing. I think was from the first study you showed, the one that hasn't been published yet. It's whether the exercise was performed in the fasted or fed state.
In the first study, we did it in a fed state. So it was done throughout the day because I think, biking people bike on average about 2 hours. They were not as trained as your individuals, and they spend a little bit less, but nevertheless, that was the average duration, I think. And we felt that we couldn't do that on a bike. But again, I think in that study, actually, I don't think it matters much. In the second study, the exercise was done in a fasted state, and I think that is actually one of the, I wouldn't say a limitation, but something that we should consider. That the response, in order to standardize it, was measured in a fasted state, but it probably would make sense to also play around with variables that come as a pre-exercise feeding. But again, because we wanted to standardize it, if you're talking about LEA, which is spread around across the whole day, but I think Carl has alluded to that, you've alluded to that, it's really actually oscillating. We don't have this integrated value. We have fluctuating states of energy availability. So actually, I think you can be in a relative, over a 24-hour, 48-hour period, you can be in a low energy availability state, but postprandially, you actually would be in a surplus after all.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to consider when we design these studies. It's kind of hard to decide where you put the exercise, and the timing of the carbohydrate intake also is going to affect the overall availability of carbohydrate, because if you have the carbohydrates right before the exercise, you're going to use more carbohydrates during exercise. It's less that is going to be stored. So whether the timing of carbohydrate ingestion affects, dysregulations that we see or not, I don't think no one's really looked into that, but I think it would be an interesting avenue of exploration. And that connects to a question that someone asked to Carl. It was Sam Shepard from LJMU. He said, like, nice work, Carl. And he wants to know if you employed any periodization strategies for carbohydrate for when they were training capacity and performance was affected by LEA.
It's a really good question, Sam. In this case study, no, we didn't. It's funny, actually. I was doing a podcast this week and people asked me about this. For this case study, because we didn't, again, want that to be a factor that might influence the results, we clamped the CHO intake, the protein intake, the fat intake every day throughout set meals. One thing I can say is that in regards to the weight loss strategies with some of the combat athletes that I work with, some of them like it like that. They like 3 set meals a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, with like clamped energy intake. Others we work with have like 6 meals a day and prefer that to be CHO periodized. One thing I will say is that the results tend to be exactly the same, whether it's clamped or whether it's periodized. But it's a great question. It's certainly a strategy that I've used in practice, but for this case study, no, we kept it consistent each day.
Great, awesome. I have a question here to me. Someone asked me that there were a lot of statistical tests performed and if there was a threshold of significance adjusted or not. No, we used a P of 0.05. And they're asking for planning a further study to see if these findings are repeatable. Of course, we want to do this. We want to do this with a more advanced methodology, having site running a more, if we can get the funding for it, a more advanced analysis of that same muscle set, looking at methylation of those samples. So epigenetic modification of the skeletal muscle. So hopefully we'll get some funding to do that. And we have other studies planned to do that. And then I have someone asking about my study, whether we used mono unsaturated fats or saturated fats. Yeah, we didn't describe the type of fats that we used, but they were mainly monounsaturated fats. So there was a lot of olive oil and walnuts that they were the source of fat for that study. So not really much saturated fats.
Jose,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There's an interesting one that I saw. I think it was Connor Spencer. That might be good to have a quick discussion.
Yes.
How do we define acute low energy availability or chronic? I find that it's quite a good question, because I know in a recent review for a paper where we've had some combat sport guys under low energy availability for 8 weeks, one of the reviewers said that's not a long time, which in comparison to some athletes may not be. But in comparison, you know, we think if some of Karsten's work that showed effects as short as 5 days is a long time. So do you guys have any thoughts on that? I know, Jose, we've had many a coffee discussing this and stuff establishing, but I thought that was a really good question.
Yeah, totally.
I think if I can jump in, I think this is something, and actually, I think Jose has been advertising our review. We've actually talked about this a little bit. And, you know, coming from an experimental side, what we've noticed is that all of the LEA studies that are really done well controlled usually result in weight loss. And actually what we see is a quite linear weight loss. So there's some form of, we're still, even though we try to separate out the energy balance and energy availability, they're actually doing the same thing in this state. So I think, you know, the question about what is acute, what is chronic, or what is short-term, what is long-term, I think a point which is really, really difficult to achieve in a controlled study, I would say it's also unethical, is actually the point where we see these metabolic adaptations that actually lead to the adaptation to the chronic energy deficit. And you know, this is in the weight loss literature, it's described quite a bit, where you actually see kind of a plateau in weight loss, which actually shows that you're not in an energy deficit anymore. So I think that would probably be the end point of the chronic LEA, where you've adapted to this state of LEA in a way that your body has suppressed certain metabolic functions. And this, obviously, I think the case can very well be made for menstruation being one of these energy expensive metabolic functions that occur. But again, going back to the weight loss literature, we can see this quite well happening after, even in long-term weight loss studies such as Calorie, for example. We're just reviewing some of that data, and it basically happens after 6 months, where you really see a much more of a plateau in weight loss. And so there is this adaptation also going on. I think Jose has shown in the data from the case study that it takes a long time to induce, and it takes a long time to rebound. And what we're really mimicking in the lab in these well-controlled studies is very different. But it's the early response that we can catch. That's why we need to look at those markers that respond very sensitively to those changes immediately, and and not in the long term. Whereas changes in bone, even changes in body composition, I think we can measure much more reliably after a long term.
I have a couple of thoughts on what about that question of Connor. One of them is whether what's chronic and what's acute. I think my point there, based on the amount of evidence that we have at the moment, is more related to, it's not an on-off switch, and it's not that automatically things go bad. So whether we know or how far we are from discovering that at this point, I really don't know. And the other thought that I have is that what we see in a laboratory setting is not necessarily ecologically valid, in the sense that when we bring people in the lab and we put them in these 3-4 days, 5 days low energy availability state, is a very homogeneous, low energy availability every day, which is normally not what you see people on the what they do on the everyday life, or the energy availability might be positive one day or high, and then low or even negative on some other days if the energy expenditure is really high or the energy intake is very low. So whether that has an effect on what is the impact of low energy availability, I don't think we know that.
Carl, I wanted to kind of pick up a question that came. I think there were a couple of questions about the weight regain that you saw. That was very impressive. I think we've actually, I've had a case study many years back where we tried to actually gain someone who was active to gain 5 kilograms, and that was very, very hard. And it seems like it was hard, but also very, very simple. But But I think one of the questions I actually have very specifically is if the increase in RMR that you saw actually above what's predicted, whether that's more of an artifact of whether basically the person was eating constantly for 24 hours, and maybe this is just additional thermic food and digestion, etc. And the second question, I think, I don't know who brought it up, but I think it's an excellent question. I think it's Therese Foster or Matheson, about whether there's some form of resilience to this weight loss in terms of, and maybe also to the weight gain, I don't know, but there's this adaptation if you do it in repeatedly, so that there's some form of physiological memory or something. I'm just throwing some of these terms out.
No,
what do you feel about that?
It's a great question, Karsten. I think the paper that I put up as well by there's a fantastic group out in Switzerland, AG Dulu, who are doing some amazing research in rebound hyperphagia, and they have the hypothesis that it could be adipostatin proteinostat regulated. To go back to your question in regards to the RMR increase, I agree in the sense that I think there were a few people have asked questions about control. And no, a lot of what we were doing wasn't controlled as you would typically do for a laboratory study, but that was the point. But I think the increase, Karsten, in terms of what we saw in the RMR, independent of diet-induced thermogenesis and everything else, bearing in mind, one thing I didn't mention is they'd completely ceased training at this point. So for 7 days, they hadn't done any training. It was too large to be an artifact simply of just non-control. So there's something going on there. There's definitely something going on. Then in terms of, like you say, the regulation, I've really tried to delve into this and dig into the research, but maybe I'm looking in the wrong places. Some of the best stuff is in the obesity literature, obviously. But there seems to be a large debate going on about the psychological versus the physiological regulation, and a bit of a disjoint between the two as well, from some of the semi-structured interviews that we took with the athletes. And there was one point that I didn't get to put in the presentation or the paper, Karsten. They mentioned that they were sitting down one day and watching the TV, and they had a half-eaten chocolate bar in the hand, and they had no recollection whatsoever of getting that. They don't remember going and getting it, opening it, eating half of it. So is there a psychological autopilot? Is it physiologically regulated? Is it? So I don't think I've answered your question. I've probably presented more questions, but I think from my perspective, it's a really, really, really interesting research area. It's one now I think I'm getting more interested in it as we go along. And I should be able to give more context from the next case study that we mentioned, because we've looked at repeated camps and we've measured longer periods this time to try and garner some of this information.
No, I think I just want to add brief something semi-anecdotally, because when we do these repeated studies, actually, we kind of go through these multiple periods of weight loss, and we actually have not seen much of a time effect, or a condition effect, where we would see people responding less in a third or fourth. But I think what you said is kind of this idea of kind of not really perceiving what you eat. I think is really interesting. Actually, I actually find the opposite to be true, because when we do these studies, usually the very last thing that we do is they filled out all the questionnaires, they've done all. Actually, I guess depending on, but yeah, usually I actually do the last. I run the DEXA on them. So just you're chatting up and you're asking, and I don't even have to ask. Everybody wants to tell me what they will have for their first meal when they're out of there. So this is something really, really fascinating. I mean, we all know that food is a very, very strong reward thing. I was actually wondering, did you measure anything like hunger, or did you ask for that during the study?
No, and this is a major oversight. Bearing in mind, so I think this is hands up, being completely honest now. My supervisor at the time, Professor James Morton, basically said, measure him for a week afterwards, because we want to see, we want that additive assessment. We didn't really think that we were going to probably get the type of data that we did. We asked them about hunger and eating and things. And I've got reams and reams of semi-structured interviews that I probably need to go into more detail. They mentioned that they were consistently hungry all of the time. Very similar to what you said. They had a master plan for what they were going to eat after weigh-in, and they followed that to the absolute letter. Believe you me, they knew what they wanted and they went and got it. But I think it was the case that we'd asked them a lot, when did you feel a need to stop doing this? And they were like, well, I feel a need to, well, not the need, I feel like I don't need to eat as much anymore now, but I'm just doing it. It's almost like an autopilot mechanism. The disappointing thing for me is I think I'd like to have probably measured it longer. But in fairness to the individual in the case study, they were really generous, giving us a week after. And once that week was over, they were like, guys, leave me alone. I don't want to do any more like measurements. I don't want to talk to you anymore about how I feel. Just leave me alone. So, but no, in the next case study that we're doing with an actual athlete, we've measured it for longer. So we should have some nice insights from that.
Fantastic, yeah. I mean, you've mentioned the rebound, the weight rebound and Abdul-Dulo studies, and I think kind of the consistent theme is that really people start this hyperphagic response really continues until you've regained actually your fat-free mass and not necessarily your body weight, which is actually kind of quite interesting, because it does.
Yeah, another interesting one, Karsten, as well. We're going to try and write up this data. We have body composition of a combat sport athlete from 2004 until present, in line with energy intake assessments. And that individual used to compete at 58 kilos coming down from 68 kilos. They now weigh 95 kilos. And I can tell you that a predominant amount of that is fat mass. And they repetitively made weight. So again, that's more of a descriptive paper, but we're going to look into the data a bit more and see if we can tease anything out of that. Sorry, Jose, we took over there.
Yeah. No, I think all the discussion has been great. I'm just letting you speak freely and step in if I have something meaningful to say. I don't have any issues with staying chatting here. People can stay or leave as they wish. I don't know if you guys have anything in mind to do right now.
Yeah, no, I'm free. If you want to run through more of the questions, happy to answer.
Yeah, no,
you make me look bad because we're actually an hour ahead of you. It's 9:08, but no, I'm happy to answer a few more, go through few more questions. You may just have to, I don't know, open a beer or something. Actually, I think there was a question from Danny Weber about the amount of protein that came, kind of comparing actually Carl and myself, 1.7, 2.3. To be honest, I think we wanted to kind of not go with the extremes. We basically had our 1.7 as kind of being the double of what the RDA is and being in line of the recommendation, but we've actually since kind of had some discussions. And if we had to repeat the study now, actually we would have gone higher. The primary issue was that it was really difficult with liquid diets without actually adding protein. That would have been possible, but other than that, it was really actually difficult to play around with that protein content, get it even higher. And actually also I mentioned that we didn't have a control group that had a low protein intake. That was virtually impossible to do with a liquid diet. So these are challenges from that I think everybody knows that is doing controlled studies. I think, Carl, you have the benefit of not having that, and you have amazing data, but yeah. I think some of it is just kind of what I guess in US American I would call it winging it. You just have to make certain decisions, and you can't make I guess we can't make the perfect study, Jose.
Yeah.
Or I think not quite yet.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a good question from Danny. Again, Karsten, I think you're right. We're lucky in an applied study like ours that the idea was to meet the caloric equivalent of rest and metabolic rate. So we had the freedom to play with those macronutrients contents, and they're not what would be regarded as substandard macronutrient intakes, for a given individual over a period of time. Generally, I think if you were going on the nose, Danny, it's going to be 2. 2 is probably your ideal. Jose, have you got any more thoughts? I mean, because a lot of what I referenced in the case study was based around some of the stuff that you did from your time in your PhD anyway, in relation to LEA and protein metabolism. So any thoughts on whether there'd be differences?
In what aspect? In oxidation?
So Danny was mentioning is 1.7, like in Karsten's study, enough, for in my case it was 2.3. What's I think what he's getting at is what's the ideal?
Yeah.
Any losses of free fat mass?
Yeah, exactly what's ideal. I honestly would have no idea to say, like, well, X amount. It seems like a little like a surplus is not really gonna hurt, and if anything, if you got a bit of surplus, it gets oxidized. I think the sort of the distribution of the protein throughout the day would make a difference as well. Yeah, but these are nothing new, digamos. Let's say my insights. But another topic that I want to bring up here, and is related to what you were saying in terms of whether you're matching RMR or not, on the effect of low energy availability on different systems, also is related to NEAT. So we had a question here from Nikita Fensham. She's asking that the model that she's saying that the model does not include NEAT, which is something that we discussed in our recent review published, went online last week in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. And of course, the different values of energy availability that we see in studies don't take into account non-exercise induced thermogenesis. And also we suspect that that itself might be affected by low energy availability. What are your thoughts, Carl, on this? Do you have any reports from your athletes who I have some insights from being a participant myself and a pilot from our studies, but my drive to do any sort of movement outside what is absolutely necessary after a few days at 10 kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass, I think it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I know, Jose, we've talked about this a lot within. So, like I say, we use the within day energy balance calculation taken from Monica's paper, which provides estimations of NEAT. And within the paper, the athletes, I think the average NEAT, average daily NEAT was between 1,000 to 1,200 kilocalories per day. So if you plug that in, if you plug that into an energy availability equation, then we're looking at numbers that are going to be a lot lower than without. I think what I would say is when the energy intake seems to be in and around RMR. So like I say, Jose, 2 grams per kilogram protein, 3 grams of carbohydrate, and we went 1 gram of fat. Independence of any, well, not independent, sorry, the additional NEAT tended to be around that value, and it was fine. We kind of asked them, are you struggling with daily routine? Are you tired? And they were like, not particularly. They were like, it's good, I'm fine, I'm okay. When we went below RMR, we seen NEAT drop drastically. I think it dropped by a couple of hundred kilocalories per day, on the basis that they just didn't have, like you've mentioned, the energy to be able to do anything. So it's definitely a consideration. There's something in it. And it's something that should maybe potentially be a consideration in modeling when it comes to thinking about the additive effects of NEAT on energy availability status, in my opinion, that is.
Yeah.
Can I add something? I think
sure.
I fully agree. I think what we really have to factor in is the kind of the inter-individual differences in NEAT, and they can be as large as 2,000 calories per day, which obviously has a huge impact. And physiologically, it doesn't really matter whether you bike to work or you bike for exercise. Both is an energy expenditure, but if we use kind of the equation of EA, I think one would be excluded and the other one wouldn't. I think you're right from that perspective. We've actually gone back and looked at data from a study that we've done earlier, and we've looked at how people change their needs and physical activity behavior. So also how much time they spend in certain activity categories in response to LEA, and at that time we actually had the luxury of doing it once with exercise and once without exercise. And actually the data show that we did not see any reduction in NEAT, or not any, at least not a meaningful reduction in NEAT. What we actually found was interesting. I mean, what we did see was a reduction in perceived parameters, like how agile, how fit they felt, how energetic they felt. So some of that is maybe kind of a first step that then maybe drives you to be less active, but maybe we were not at the point where we fully caught that. But actually what I found interesting is that when we did this with exercise and without exercise, but again, at the same level of EA, which means that when you're exercising, you can eat more. So people were actually more active, even though they were in the same EA state, when they were exercising in addition, which is kind of funny, or at least during the time that they had available, which makes sense from a standpoint. NEAT is usually things that you have to do. It's not like you decide. I mean, to some degree you can, but doing household things, you can't really decide. I guess unless you live alone, you can't really decide to not do certain things. So it may be more structured into your life, so it's not as variable. But again, how you feel about it may be different. But yeah, I think it's an ongoing issue. I think the simplicity of the NEAT equation actually is that it's nice that you don't have to account for it, but it is a limitation.
Yeah.
But I think for what it was designed and how it was intended, especially by Anne Laux, I think the whole idea is that the NEAT contribution, even if you counted for it, wouldn't have a huge effect on the dose response.
Yeah.
But individually, it may be different.
You raise an interesting point there, Karsten, as well about NEAT that's necessary and NEAT that isn't. Because again, this detail isn't included in our case study, but the majority of NEAT that came from the athlete was going to university and also going to work. Because again, we got an idea of what they were doing, and the rest of the time, and I'm sure Jose can attest to this in some of his anecdotal work, it was relaxed. It was not do a lot. So, but no, you raise an interesting point on that for sure.
And that's where you may see a difference in a professional athlete versus an amateur athlete. I think that's something really to consider. It's how much time you have for how do you have the luxury to be basically inactive at the end.
Yeah.
Great. I think we could stay talking for the whole night, but I think it's time to wrap this up. What do you guys think? And we can maybe have a chapter 2 some months when we have some data after COVID-19 allows us to go back in the lab and collect some data.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. There's not much more to say other than thanking everyone again for being present. Also thanking our librarian.